The ones who are lauded as being the best are not those ones. Those the ones that are there are the ones who are willing to do anything and everything to make it to that top. They're not the best of us.
We start with a commentary on the preface written by the author in 1992.
And to the question about the success of his book, Viktor Frankl doesn't treat it as a big achievement. Rather, he says that the fact that people are reaching out for a book that seeks to give them or to respond to the question about the meaning of life is really a response to the misery of the times that we are living in. And so that's the first point, that the meaning of life is a question which is burning in our hearts at this point, at our epoch. And the second point that he makes then also is that the fact that the book is successful is an accident. He did not seek out to write this successful book. And the advice, therefore, that he gives, he says, to his students in America and in Europe is, he says, is don't aim for success. Don't aim at success. The more you aim at it and make it a target, the more you're going to miss it. For success, like happiness, cannot be pursued. It must ensue, and it only does so as the unintended side effect of one's dedication to a cause greater than oneself, or as the byproduct of one's surrender to a person other than oneself. Unlike modern times, where we are often told that go for what you want, do whatever makes you happy. He says, no, you have to dedicate yourself, you have to give yourself to a cause that is greater than you. And the second point is similar to the first. He says, even if the cause, you're not dedicated to a cause greater than you, then we have to give ourselves to someone other than ourselves. And if you do that, then like happiness, success will ensue. It'll come as a result of us having to do specific things. Success, like happiness, is not overnight. It's going to come in the long run. It's not immediate. And in this environment of instant gratification that we live in, that's going to be a tough call for us to make. The decision that I'm going to live for somebody else other than myself, I'm going to live for a cause greater than myself. To make this decision is going to be a tough one because we're not going to see the results immediately. We're never going to wake up one morning, tomorrow, or 3 months later. It's going to take some time before we see the results. So it's a tough decision, but of course, as we see in Viktor Frankl's life, it's something worth pursuing. Frankel also responds to a question that he says is often been asked. Why didn't you get away from Austria? Why didn't you go away to another country when this was happening? And then Frankel tells us the story of how he actually had the opportunity to leave the country. He had the opportunity to go to the United States, and his visa was ready. And around that time, there was already a kind of animosity building against the Jewish people in Austria. Temple had just been burnt down. In any case, Frankel talks about this and he says that he had this opportunity, but he was worried about leaving his parents behind. And he felt that it was his duty to look after his old parents. So a stone was saved from the temple by his father. A stone was saved, and that stone referred to the fourth commandment, which talks about respect of one's parents. And for Viktor Frankl, who was completely torn, do I go to America? Do I stay here? That stone for him was the response from above that he should stay here and look after his parents. And when the Germans invaded Austria, he was shipped off to the concentration camps. The experiences in the concentration camp are unimaginable. Those of you who have watched the movies and read other books will agree to this. In Viktor Frankl's book, he says that here he's not really documenting all that went on. Rather, he's just picking up specific incidences that will then make the case for the story that he's telling us. Now, he says that you cannot imagine what life was like at the concentration camp. Life in the concentration camp was a grueling fight for survival for one's friends and for oneself. And one was always fighting at every point in time. But he gives us an example of the transport where a truck was brought in and people had to get onto the truck and they were being shipped off purportedly to another camp. But people knew that when you're getting onto that truck, you are actually being taken to the gas chambers. So to avoid getting onto the truck, people did everything. And he says that at that point in time, there was no time, there was no moment for moral or ethical considerations. You just had to make sure that you didn't get onto the truck and your friend didn't get onto the truck. If it meant replacing somebody else, pushing somebody else forward, or replacing their name, whatever, that's what you did. So staying alive was hard, he says. On the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who, after years of trekking from camp to camp, had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest and otherwise, even brutal force, theft, and betrayal of their friends in order to save themselves. We who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. Well, two ideas come across here. One, we now understand how Viktor Frankl survives. He did so by some miracle, by pure miracle or chance. That's how he survived. But at the same time, there were also other survivors who who managed to make it through very nefarious times. The other point that I'm thinking about here that occurred to me when I read this, though, was about this whole question of survival and the people who make it to the other side. And being where we are and being in the environment that we live in, I notice, or you'll notice that sometimes the people that we see being lauded or the people who have made it to the top, we are often being convinced that those are the best people. And this can drive one to pessimism or to despair or disillusionment. Because the truth is, sometimes the ones who make it to the top, the ones who are lauded as being the best, are not those ones. The ones that are there are the ones who are willing to do anything and everything to make it to that top. They're not the best of us. And so now Frankel then now tells us what it was like going into the camp. You know, they had to be stripped naked. Their hair is cut off. They're whipped. They're really degraded as human beings. And of course, the first reaction is shock, as often happens when something unexpected and so momentous happens in our life, so negatively momentous happens in our life. He says the first reaction was shock. Frankel then recounts us an experience he had where he was carrying the manuscript of his research and approaches one of the guards and says to them, I know I should be happy about the fact that I've escaped with my life, but this manuscript contains my life's work. It's everything that I've ever done all my life, he says. Do you understand that? He says to the guard. And the guard smiles at him and then says to him, shit. And Frankel here does something which is extremely important. He says, at that moment, I saw the plain truth and did what marked the culminating point of the rest of the phase of my psychological reaction. I struck out my whole former life. What does it actually mean when Frankel says that I struck out my whole former life? Frankel did something very important here. He accepted the reality. You see, at the beginning, earlier on, he said that a lot of them went through a process where they were having an experience of reprieve. And at that point in time, he realizes that there is no reprieve coming. Forget all that has happened. And now, here is where you are now. Go forward from here. It was a hard call to make, but when I think about it, it was an important one because from then on, he can now deal with the future because he knows that this is what is going on, this is what my life looks like. And so now you can begin to deal with it instead of thinking back, but I used to be a psychiatrist, I was eminent, I was known by everybody. No, now this is who you are. You're a prisoner. He even recounts a point where he once had to dig a trench all by himself, a huge trench from an underground trench. And he digs the trench, for which he says he got a packet of cigarettes, which of course was very important because that's what people used to use for trade in prison. And so, so you can see this attitude change was an important step to make, is an important step to make when you're looking at one's reality, at your current reality, is to say, okay, this is where I am and this is what is happening. And then, of course, he says that they now adopted a different state of mind, which was a mind of almost curiosity, a detached curiosity, where they step back and they just begin to observe what is going on. So the detached curiosity, he makes certain notes. And one of the notes, for example, is that people who used to say, I'm a light sleeper, I can't sleep with too much noise, they slept throughout the night. He says it was surprising that they had practically no clothes and it was so cold, and you'd think that they would have died of influenza or they would get, some kind of sickness. Nothing. They still managed to survive. And the other thing that he talks about here, then he talks about, of course, some of them did consider suicide. They considered, just what they would call running to the wire. You would go there and be done with it, he said. But he said himself, he made the decision not to do that. And he makes the decision not to kill himself for personal reasons, which he's going to tell us about later. It's so interesting how even as these events are taking place, Viktor Frankl is processing it and making certain decisions. What a lesson for all of us. Again, we have to look at reality and then think through it. And having thought through it, we come up with certain decisions. And the decisions are really important. Because you see, once we make decisions, in a sense, we're also creating principles by which we will continue to live by. And this is what you're seeing happening to Frankl here. He says, I will not kill myself. And he's made that decision. He struck out his whole former life. I'm not going to adopt an attitude of, I'm a doctor, therefore I might get certain treatment. No, you're now a prisoner, behave like a prisoner here. And then, in the evening of the first night when they're there, one of their friends comes. He had been brought to this camp earlier. And now, of course, imagine how happy you would be to see somebody who has already been there. And it would be nice because you're thinking, wow, at least they will tell me, what's going on. And of course, the guy does proceed to tell them. And then he says to them, make sure that you shave every day, even if you have to give your last piece of bread for it. Because if you look younger and stronger, then you're not likely to be sent to the gas chambers. But he makes a last point, which is of note here. He turns to Frankl and he says to Frankl, I hope you don't mind my telling you frankly. To the others, he repeated, of all of you, he is the only one who must fear the next selection. So don't worry. Wow. It's your first night. You've been through this crazy experience, and this is what this man is telling you. Wow. Only one thought came to mind when I read this. And it was, be very careful who you go to at your lowest moment.